Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia Synthx-V tutorial series. Today we're going to spend the majority of our time looking at the arpeggiator and the sequencer, two separate functions in the synthesizer. We're also going to have a quick look at macros and the keyboard page, but I do think that both of those pages are relatively straightforward, so we're not going to spend an enormous amount of time there. But let's make a start with the multi-art page. Now this is a significant advancement on the arpeggiator that came with the original Synthx. There's a kind of nod to it in the fact that it's still visible in the front end and you can select each one of the four arpeggiators, and we're going to have a detailed look at them in a moment. But really this is eye candy. This is because the synthesizer originally had an arpeggiator which was pretty impressive for the time, but nevertheless it's been significantly enhanced by Arturia, and we get to all of those extra features by clicking the edit button, which simply opens the advanced page, and here it is. So we have four separate arpeggiators. Here they are. At the moment they're all disabled. Let's turn the first one on. Now even though at the moment we're only hearing layer A because we're soloed, this arpeggiator is potentially outputting, and in fact actually outputting to both layers. I'll disable B even though we don't need to. To edit the arpeggiator, just click its name, just click where it says ARP1, and now all of these controls highlight. This is where we configure how the arpeggiator is going to work. So a very brief definition before we start. What is an arpeggiator? It's something that takes a chord, breaks that chord up, and plays each note individually according to a prescribed algorithm. This is a very different concept to the idea of sequencers, and we will have a look at the sequence page later. There is one in the Synthx. Sequencers are all about setting specific modulation values on a step-by-step basis so that we basically get to define whatever pattern we want. That's not the case with an arpeggiator. The only thing that you're in control of is which notes you play. So I'm going to play a C major now. What you're hearing there is C, E, G, C, E, G, C, E, G spanned over 3 octaves. Let's figure out why. Well, firstly, we're in up mode. There are many different arpeggiator shapes. Now this little 5x5 grid that you see below is a purely graphical representation. Think of it like a visual mnemonic. It's not really doing anything. It's not functionally telling you how the arpeggiator works. It's just giving you a decent graphical idea of what it's doing. If we click in that grid and we head over to the classic submenu, which is where most of the common arpeggios live, let's choose up and down instead. And now you can see a new visual shape just representing that idea. Now when I play the same C major chord, now this is something really important to note about what just happened there. We played all the way up 3 octaves and then all the way back down. We didn't play the first octave and then the second octave and then the third octave. The reason we're spanning over 3 octaves is the octave range down here. If I set that to 2.5, we'll only get 2 octaves plus 6 notes. So this is a digital representation of a 12-note octave. That means we're going to miss out the G on the upper octave. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there are only 8 notes in that pattern rather than 9 that we started with. And now I'll introduce some of the more complex arpeggios. Some of these are actually pretty difficult to figure out exactly what it's doing. If we go into the creative page, let's try the groove arpeggio. Let's see what this is doing. Again, I'll just play a C major. So you kind of get an idea of why they've used this particular graphical illustration, the 2 low notes and then the higher note. It's kind of making sense. But you are absolutely not getting a 5-note arpeggio. Don't be fooled into thinking that this has got anything to do with specifying exactly how many notes are being played. You just have to listen to it and figure out, given the note offsets that you've plumbed into the arpeggiator, what it's actually doing, and it changes depending on how many notes you play. So now I'll introduce a B into that chord in order to make a C major 7. Here we go. So you can hear some of those notes clearly being played more than others. We were only hearing the B once. The point I'm making here really is that these arpeggios are very much a suck it and see kind of thing. Plug it in, play the notes that you want to play, and hear what it's doing. It's not very often critically important that you understand exactly the order of the notes that are being played, but if it is, then the best thing to do is to slow the arpeggiator right down. using the rate button. At the moment we're operating at 1/8 speed. If you slow this right down and play that major 7 chord again, it's going to be pretty easy to figure out eventually what's going on. Now all the arpeggios we've played so far have been very regimented. You're hearing very consistent notes played with a very consistent beat. That's because by default the rhythm is fully enabled. So this rhythm section specifies when the notes are going to be played. The way this rhythm ring works is that every one of these blue dots represents a played note. Every time you click on a note, you're basically disabling that part of the rhythm. What this is going to generate is potentially highly complex or syncopated patterns. The important thing to bear in mind, however, is that the arpeggio is always played exactly as it's supposed to be. In other words, you never miss out any notes simply because you're missing out a space. Let's go back to a simple arpeggio so that we can represent this more easily. I'll just choose an up arpeggio. I'm going to play my C major chord again, and you're going to hear C, E, G repeated over and over again, regardless of all of these gaps. This gives you the potential to make really interesting rhythmic patterns using the spaces in between the arpeggiators. It's not like muting notes. If you drew these notes into the editor in Cubase and muted some of them, then you're changing the order in which the notes are being played. That's not happening here. The order's always the same, the timing of them changes. Now while we're looking at this rhythm section, this is a good opportunity to talk about the difference between local edits. So if I'm going to change this rate function here, I'm acting on only arpeggiator number 1, and global arpeggiator edits, which we do through the left-hand panel, because as you can see, that's got a rate control as well. So this is the master rate, and this applies to the entire arpeggiator. But inside each one of the 4 sub-arpeggios, you can specify different rates. At the moment, we're only looking at a single arpeggio, so these functions are effectively identical. Now they do operate with different parameters, because at the moment this function is synced and is operating in fractions of bars, and this one is a simple multiplier, as you can see. In a few moments I'll show you an example of a preset that uses 4 different arpeggiators and they have multiple different rhythms playing against each other, but I just want to keep things nice and simple at the moment. I'm just bringing your attention to the fact that there are 2 different locations where seemingly the same function is being accomplished, and we're just talking about the difference between a single arpeggio and all 4 arpeggios together. Exactly the same concept applies to gate, so let's jump over to the notes section and talk about gate. This is how long each of the arpeggio steps take. As I decrease this gate value, each note is going to be played for a shorter amount of time. And I'm going to accomplish exactly the same goal by using the master gate control. And in fact, you can see that multiplier reducing. So this is your master percent. If I set that to 50 and then adjust the multiplier, you'll see the fractional ring around the outside change. So it's a very nice visual representation of the combined effect of these 2 values being multiplied together. You can also apply a scalar mask to arpeggios, so I'm going to carry on playing that C major chord, but this time I'm going to set it in minor mode, which means basically whenever it finds a note that isn't in the key of C minor, it's going to adjust that note down to the nearest available place. So when I play C major, now you're hearing E flats. Switch back to chromatic mode, which basically means the notes that are played are going to be represented. It's covering the entire keyboard. So what I want to do at this point is load up one of the presets. In the sequence menu, there's a preset called Fairies Hideout. Let's load that. This is a really nice illustration of 4 arpeggiators playing together. So again, I'm going to play a simple C major chord. Let's hear this. Now can you see these different strobing lights travelling around the ring? That's the 4 different arpeggiators travelling at different rates. So let's have a look at these 4 arpeggios, see what's going on. Arp 1 is at regular rate. Arp 2 is travelling at half the rate, as is Arp 3, and Arp 4 is travelling at a quarter of the rate. Get them all running again. And now you can see the visual representation of each of those 4 rings in the concentric circles of the 4 different rhythms. It's a beautiful representation actually, it's a really nice graphical interface, I like it a lot. Now I'm going to solo each of the arpeggios. Next to the name we have a little S, click that button and it basically just temporarily disables the other arpeggios. So now you can see the pattern that's being played by this first arpeggio, and it's not just the rhythm that's defining what this pattern is. We have a complex arpeggio as well. This 8-bit preset, you can get a decent idea of what it's doing from the graphical representation. The combination of these 2 things together is what's giving you that complexity. And of course that's all spanning over 3 octaves. Arpeggio number 2 is a simple up arpeggio, but this time it's smaller. Can you see that there are only 7 lights in the rhythm section? This means it's going to have a pretty complex relationship with arpeggio 1, which has 16 steps. Arpeggio 3 has the as played arpeggio with a big friendly P to indicate it. This means that the order of the notes that I play, I'll go C, E, G, determines how the arpeggio is going to sound. So now if I play that arpeggio G, E, C instead, we have a different arpeggio being played. So this is going to introduce variance or randomness to the arpeggios. Each chord that we play is potentially going to sound different every time we play it. Arpeggio number 4 is affected by a feature we haven't looked at yet, which is the retrig value in the rhythm section. Can you see that this is set to a quarter? The other arpeggios are either effectively free spinning, they have no retrigger at all, so they're basically just spinning around doing their own thing, waiting for you to play notes, or they're triggered by the playing of the notes themselves. That's important if it's got something to do with the order of the notes that you're playing. But ARP4 doesn't do that actually, it re-triggers every quarter bar. That means that regardless of the fact that I'm playing a C major chord, you're only actually hearing 1 note because it's constantly re-triggering. You can see this little blue dot. And it doesn't sound particularly interesting on its own, but when added with all the other stuff, that's what's generating the overall rhythm. Okay, so if arpeggios are all about playing a chord, breaking it down, playing the individual notes, now let's have a look at the other pattern-based tool that we have in the Synthx, which is the sequencer. I'm going to reload my default template. I'm going to jump over to the function page, but I could have used any of the modulators. And this time we're going to have a look at the modulator we haven't seen yet, which is the sequencer. Each one of these bars that you can see strobing across the screen represents a modulation zone. If I click in any of the bars, I'm setting these arbitrary values between 0 and 1 that are going to define an amount of modulation that's sent somewhere in the synthesizer. At the moment, the step sequencer isn't assigned anywhere, so it's not going to do any work. Let's map it to the cutoff. It's an easy thing to do. Let's pick up the sequencer, drag it over onto the frequency control. I'm going to bring the frequency knob down and then increase the amount of modulation that's being applied. Now by default it's a 16-step sequence, but I can drag this curtain in to make it an 8-step sequence instead. Speed it up. Well, that sounds similar to something you'd get out of the random module, so let's try something a little bit more ordered. That's better. So if you think about that for a moment, the sequencer is actually much more powerful than the arpeggiator because the arpeggiator can only modulate pitch. It's basically a note-based module. I've just modulated the cutoff there. In fact, I can modulate anything I want across the synthesizer. And don't worry, we are going to have a look at modulating pitch shortly, and I'm going to get the sequencer to actually play a sequence of notes. But I just want to think about the flexibility of the sequencer module itself, having the ability to draw these very specific modulation values gives you a really powerful tool. By way of illustration, we're going to dip back into the preset bank. I'm going to have a look at another sequence. This time it's the binary overflow sequence. And here you can see that we've used two different step sequence modules. I'll play a note first to hear the preset, and then we'll talk about what's going on. Okay, so there's clearly some sort of periodic pulsing thing going on there. We do have an arpeggio as well, so that's something to bear in mind. Let's play the C major chord. So now you can see the arpeggio notes being played. So what are the step sequencers doing? Let's hover over each of them and see. So the first one is being mapped into both layers noise generators, A and B, and also into the chorus dry wet. So those bursts of noise that we're getting are coming from step sequencer number 1. Step sequencer number 2 is doing a number of different jobs. You can see 3 assignments to each of layers A and B, and as I'm hovering over the control you can see 2 of them into the multimode filter, envelope and resonance, and also the filter envelope. Let's hear it. Depending on which note is being played, you can really hear that resonance popping through. But also there's a 7th routing. If we scroll down, it's also being mapped into the Arpeggiator 1 gate, so it's lengthening the notes of the arpeggiated sounds as it's being played. Another function that I want to draw to your attention in the sequencer is the way that it's being triggered. We have a new retrigger option, and both of the step sequencers are set to ARP start. So basically every time I play some notes and we get the arpeggiator running, each of these step sequencers is initialized and the entire thing runs in sync. This is easiest to see in the second step sequencer because we have this maximum modulation being poured into the filter, which is opening the gate and giving you that really brash sound. So that's a nice demonstration of the step sequencer being used as a really powerful modulation tool. Now let's have a look at it playing some notes in a more traditional sequence. I'm going to reopen my default template again. I'll use modulator 3 this time, because why not? I'm going to reduce it back down to an 8-step sequencer again, just to make it a little bit easier for me, because what I'm going to have to do now is plumb in some very specific numbers into the sequencer. The sequencer in turn is going to be mapped into the oscillator's transpose function. And how you do this is very important. If you want any kind of chromatic value out of this thing, you need to be quite careful with how you set it up. You're going to want to set your maximum modulation, so set the sequencer all the way up to +1. And now I need to figure out how much modulation I need to feed into this system. Well, I've actually worked this out empirically, and during the editing process I'll pop up a box that contains all of the values. You can take a screenshot if you need to. But basically each one of these modulation offsets can correspond to a specific pitch value in your transpose function. 0.5, for instance, is exactly 1 octave. I'm just temporarily going to reduce the window down to a single note. That basically means that I can work out this stuff just by holding a single note down. So this is what I did for each of the 12 notes of the chromatic scale. I'm aiming for a G here, by the way. I play a key and then just adjust the modulation amount until I hit G on the tuner. 0.292 will get you a G. You're going to find F at 0.208. And there it is. So as you work out what each of these values are, now you can reopen your 8-step sequencer, plumb in some 208s, 292s and 500s, and you're going to create a sequence that contains roots, perfect fourths and perfect fifths. This is just a combination of left clicking and right clicking. I will cut most of this out during editing because you don't need to see me plumbing all of these values in. And that'll do us. We've just designed an 8-step sequence. Now I happen to know if I'm playing in the key of C major, I can play C, F, G. You know, there's actually 5 different notes I can play, all of which will stay in the same key. Here's a simple example using C's, F's, G's and A's. So I'll get that sequence running in the background. Now at the moment it's not synced properly to my DAW, so let's fix that. We'll set the retrig to mono, which basically means each time a new note's played in the editor, it's going to refire the sequence. And I'll set my sync to 1/16, and we should be fully synced up now. To make the sound a bit more interesting, I'm going to send exactly the same step sequencer into the filter cutoff as well. So these modulation amounts are doing 2 different jobs now. Now then, everything that we've done up until now has been up to but not exceeding 0.5. If you go past 0.5, you're going to need to adjust your transpose value, because at the moment we can only transpose up a single octave. Let's set this C to a G, which is going to be 0.792. We don't have enough headroom at the moment to hear that G. But if I bring the transpose down to -12, now you're hearing that upper G. Of course, everything is an octave lower. You need to fix that, bring it back up to 4 foot. And there's my G. Finally today, I said we'd have a very quick look at the macros and keyboard sections. The reason why we can do these very quickly is because we've already seen all of the functionality elsewhere in this tutorial series. The default preset in the template directory actually has macros pre-configured. Basically what's going on with macros is that multiple different collections of routings are all clustered together under a single control. It's like mapping multiple different things from one of your modulation sources, but you get them permanently in your interface. Down at the bottom, these 4 controls are always there. So for instance, when we have a look at the brightness macro, this is controlling the cutoff frequency of both layers simultaneously, something which it can be a bit of a pain to do when you're editing these things, because normally you're editing in solo mode. Well, the macro takes care of both layers simultaneously. So if I bring the frequency controls down for both layers A and B, play a note, and then increase the brightness macro, you can see the modulation amount actually updating in the interface as well. So it's just another modulation source like anything else. The idea is though that you've baked in these 4 kind of master controls into the primary user interface, and they're really convenient shortcuts for accessing groups of functionality. And you'll generally find that most of them are to do with pairing the 2 layers together. So the timbre control, which is macro number 2, is mapping to both layer A and B resonance. The time control is all about attack and release. There's 8 controls here, 4 for layer A, 4 for layer B, and it takes care of both the attack and the release controls for both envelopes. And the movement macro in the default preset is currently mapped into the 2 LFO depths. So by default, this is going to modulate the oscillator pitch and the filter cutoff. And there it is. So these are just defaults. The macros that we're looking at here, this is just what this preset happens to have. But if we just choose a completely random preset, I've not chosen one in particular, but as we go through, you can see oscillator 1 volume is now controlled by the timbre control. As a matter of interest, and this is a good illustration actually, this timbre control has nothing to do with timbre. It's controlling the volume of oscillator 1. If I double click in the word timbre inside the editor itself, not in the left-hand panel, I can rename these macros to anything that I want. And as you can see in the lower interface as well, it's now updated to represent what it's really doing. Finally, the keyboard section, which looks really intimidating because it's got all of these different controls, is incredibly simple. This is your primary way to interact with your physical hardware. So here's my modulation wheel, for instance. Of course, I've chosen a preset that doesn't have any modulation settings, so I'll just cycle through to one that does. This is what's going to happen when I move my modulation wheel. So let's have a listen to that in use. Modulation wheel all the way down. You hear the envelope decay shortening as I bring the modulation wheel down and then up. And each one of your keyboard controls can obviously be mapped dynamically to wherever you want to send them. And that's brought us to the end of the tutorial series. Hope you enjoyed it. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. There's Patreon and YouTube channel member links below if you'd like to help support me further. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.